Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is a practical philosopher and meditation teacher. After finishing his PhD, he completed training with the American Philosophical Practitioners Association in philosophical counseling. Over the past 10 years, he has helped countless individuals inquire into the most fundamental questions of life. His ideas have been featured in Quartz, The Guardian, Big Think, TEDx, and the Washington Post. He partakes in a vigorous meditation practice of 4 hours each day, including a one-day meditation retreat each week and a monthly 5 to 7 day-long meditation intensive. Using an approach of analytical rigor, and compassionate openness, he teaches meditation to individuals who have an earnest desire for awakening. Andrew James Taggart, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Artem.
So I just did a philosophical inquiry call with you last week, which was a unique and enriching experience. And I definitely want to talk more about philosophizing together practice.
Yeah.
But first, I'd love to dive a little into meditation. And what strikes me in particular is how intensive and committed your meditation practice is at 4 hours a day and a one-day retreat each week, and then a 5 to 7 day intensive every month. That's a lot of meditation. So I'm really curious what got you into meditation, and how did you even get to a point of having such a committed and intensive practice?
Yeah. Well, the short version, as I may have told you when we were philosophizing last week, is that my eldest sister died quite unexpectedly rather, in 2014. And that led me to ask some pretty basic questions over and above that I've been raising in the context of philosophy. And the really basic question I was asking is, what is this all about? Or indeed, is this all there is? And I trust that your viewers will hear that question and perhaps feel that it's rather vague and a bit squishy, but that tends to be the first way that a genuine existential question arises. So that's how it was for me. And I felt that even though classical philosophy that comes from ancient Greece was very, very powerful and still is very powerful, that there was still something quite missing in the approach, and that was the ineffable, or the nature of truth, or the fundamental understanding of consciousness. And so that led my wife and me to begin a more intensive approach to what turned out to be non-dual spirituality, or non-dual perennial teaching. And it wasn't as if in day one we were interested in sitting for a long period of time. It's like most people, we sat for a short while. But there's a very natural development in what in Advaita Vedanta is called the longing for liberation. A very deep and increasingly intense and intensive longing for liberation. So the numbers included in the website are slightly meant to indicate to people of a tech sort some degree of commitment. But it's there in some sense beside the point. It's rather that the questions themselves become more and more vigorous, realer and realer, to the point at which this becomes your fundamental concern. So Zen, for example, is simply something that set up a series of psychotechnologies, practices that allow for a vigorous, accelerated, profound, deep dive into these questions, in as much as it foregrounds the point of zazen, or seated meditation. It's not necessary, but it turns out to be an excellent laboratory in order to turn inward and to investigate what we truly are.
So you mentioned Advaita Vedanta, you mentioned Zen. So can you speak about what your process was coming across different spiritual teachings and that you studied over the years, and where you ultimately landed in terms of what resonates most for you, or what you feel has worked most for you?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, to begin with, I began with Socratic philosophy, and Socrates helps us to ask a genuine question out of freshness, out of truly not knowing. It obviously brings to the fore a dialogical situation such that there's a questioner and an answer. So what happens is that somehow through the dialogical format, the answer is the truth of the matter. And it comes out through a fidelity to the keen questioning and keen answering. That was more or less what I'd been trained in and became quite familiar with and have been obviously quite keen on. So I offer that as the backdrop to what comes next, and that is that there are some traditions in the East that are very interested in what's called the path of knowledge, path of jnana, the Bhagavad Gita. Some are interested in the path of love, or bhakti, or devotion. And I would suggest to perhaps many people listening to this podcast that it's usually best to begin with the path of knowledge, not with the path of love, because the path of love can more easily lead to forms of exploitation between teacher and guru, or teacher and disciple, and so forth. Whereas that's not really something you commonly find in the path of knowledge. In any case, that was my aside. So I was drawn to inquiring into these ultimate matters, and I began to find that, for example, there are some Eastern practices that bring this right to the forefront. Zen, for example, particularly Rinzai Zen, uses a koan or hua tao, like who am I, or what is wu, or what is mu. That's a question. Or who is the one dragging this corpse around? Question that I raised in our conversation last week. There are other forms, but they're ways of utilizing the mind that allows the question to be raised, and the answer is beyond the context, the confines of the mind. So that's what appealed to me about Zen. And then Zen obviously appeals to me because it has immense intensity, extraordinary concentration of energy on what this is all about. Advaita Vedanta similarly is interested in inquiry-based forms of practice. In that case, it provides much more intellectual scaffolding. I argue that Advaita Vedanta is probably one of the easiest, most natural traditions for those in the West who have an intellectual predilection, because it's keen on metaphysics, it's keen on pondering or intellectualizing, even if it suggests that that's not the end of the story. It provides a language that's very clear to us, a language like consciousness or awareness, mind, body, senses. It talks about the negative way as well as the positive way. It brings a self-inquiry, a la Ramana Maharshi, into the picture. I can set this all out in greater detail later on if it becomes relevant to do so. But you see that the background inquiry led to finding traditions that were inquiry-based, as I would call them. And then I sifted through others, such as Christian mysticism at an early point. And I found that Christian mysticism had a few things that, by my lights, made it difficult for Westerners to grok. The first is that it's a path of love and not a path of knowledge, which will appeal to some who have a very strong heart-centered approach to life. But to many of us who have grown up with using our intellectual powers, there's something rather inscrutable about it. Secondly, Christian mysticism, as I told you last week, doesn't seem to have a continuous tradition of practice, of vetting, of iterating, of teaching, and of imparting, sifting and winnowing, right? As you find, let's say, in certain forms of Buddhism or in Advaita Vedanta. And so that pointed me to the realization that I needed to stick with inquiry-based ones. Then there are others that some people in the West might be very interested in, such as Tibetan Buddhism. But I must say, Tibetan Buddhism, for those who don't have a Lama or Rinpoche, will find the language, I think, of some of these texts initially rather impenetrable. It's not natural. since I've tried to look into those. I'm not arguing that one can't be interested in Tibetan Buddhism. It's wonderful. There are other wonderful ones like Sufism as well. But the question is, can I actually open the book? Can I open a sacred text like the Upanishads? And does it speak to me in a manner that's consistent with the kind of training or background that I have? Can I get into it? Is there a doorway for me here? So that's through that various, rather experimental approach, I landed on these two that I think are actually quite good for a number of Westerners, particularly for those who have strong intellectual powers.
Yeah, so you mentioned that, some of these traditions, you can pick up the book and it's kind of easier to grasp what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious if in your own practice, if you've worked with other teachers, if you worked with lineages and things like that, or if a lot of it has been just kind of your own internal work, reading the text and just sitting there and allowing it to process.
I have sometimes my wife and I have sat in various sanghas, and we have certainly met certain teachers, and I've gone on retreats with some very nice contemporary teachers. That's been a pretty important part of what has shaped our life. At some point, however, I did find that Advaita Vedanta's triple method really spoke to me. The triple method goes like this. It's very, very intuitive. You first listen to a teacher, be it living, again, we'll say in form or not in form, whether it be Ramana Maharshi, who left the body in 1949 or 50, or a contemporary teacher. It's a listening that is receptive, quiet, heart open, non-judgmental. And then once you've listened to that teaching, and I might use the Upanishads as my example here, since I do think the Upanishads, at least some of those texts, are very, very easy to get the flavor of. Then the second part involves pondering or contemplating. For example, why is there suffering? If what I truly am is Buddha nature or Brahman or Para-Brahman or the ultimate, then why is that not clear to me right now? One simple question that's commonly asked. Another question that's commonly asked is, why is this so hard? Why am I struggling so much? Well, these are things that need to be pondered, or can be pondered at a high level, high intellectual level. And doing so basically irons out the doubts. That's what satsang does. You ask a question of a teacher, or perhaps of a teaching, with a view to resolving mind-concocted doubts. So you're letting mind rest. And the third part is diving deep through meditation, which is obviously ultimately it's non-conceptual or ineffable. And by my lights, you are either, it could be said, looking for who you are, or more appropriately, you're letting go of the apparent ignorance that is seemingly obscuring your very nature. The latter is more of a cumbersome expression, but it's more accurate. Basically, what the Eastern teaching says is that we are this, Buddha nature, other shunyata, etc. But there's an epistemic error. We don't know what we are. So all it does is remove the ignorance that appears to obscure our very nature. So the triple method is what has really spoke to me in the final analysis. Listening, pondering, discussing, hashing out. And then you really have to let that all go in a way, and you come to various kinds of meditations where there's just quietness. As Ramana Maharshi would say, the highest teaching is silence.
Yeah, so I have one more question I kind of want to ask about meditation, and then maybe we could pivot into philosophy. Sure. So what strikes me is you mentioned your wife several times, and that you guys are both, engaging in this meditation practice and this kind of deep, intensive practice. And I'm just curious, is this something that you both were doing separately and then you just kind of came together and you were already on the same page? Is it something that you discovered together? I'm curious because, I'm sure there's other couples that engage in these kind of practices, but I know there's also plenty of people out there where it's one person is really into meditating or they're on the path of awakening and the other person is not. So I'm just curious how that kind of alignment happened in your life.
Well, we'll get into philosophy, I'm sure, in a moment, because this is a ripe and somewhat vexed question, I would say, for a number of people. How can I be on the path and the one I dearly love, who dearly loves me, not be on the path at all, not be open at all to it? Maybe this person is a classical liberal, so to speak, and is tolerant of the life I seem to live over here. We'll have to get around to that because it really is quite an extraordinary question. But as for the autobiographical answer, I would say it's been a deep blessing and a gift to have my wife Alexandra in my life, because almost from the very first, it depends on how much you want to get into synchronicities or really interesting stuff. But from the very first, we started to have some experiences together, some non-ordinary experiences together that began to indicate that reality was more than we thought it was. And also from the very first, really, she was the one who had a stronger, very natural or inchoate spiritual impulse than I. So in the early days of 2013 or so, she was the one kind of pulling me along. And I'm quite grateful for that. Because slowly, everyone is your teacher, as Buddhism would say. Slowly, we began to, or quickly, I should say, we began to converge. And so since then, 2013 or so, we have done virtually everything together. We often sit together daily. We discuss these matters, we ponder them together. We've gone on every retreat together. I can't easily imagine the spiritual path without her. And the deepening of the understanding has come from both of us. So that's why there's a generally strong sense of we here. And ultimately, of course, there must be a sense of we, because the ultimate truth is that, to put it in one form of the teaching, there's only oneness. So every single apparently separate being is nothing but a scintillating manifestation of a single, unbroken, unborn, undying reality. So that there could actually be heart resonance between multiple beings is not at all far-fetched. In fact, it's an obvious implication of the teaching.
Yeah, perhaps we can take that logic and apply it to being on the path or not being on the path.
Mm-hmm.
Is there really a path mm-hmm. or not a path? It's all the path.
Certainly.
Pathless path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's also true. I think there are times early on when someone who is, so to speak, on the path might find that there is some kind of dissonance between him, say, and his significant other. But if that one really sticks with it, that at some point there is deep, deep acceptance and boundless love. But the middle part, the part where one is going off on a meditation retreat while the other is staying home, for example, with the kids, is not always easy as a matter of practice.
So this is where I want to kind of ask a really basic question, but I think it's
Sure.
an important question, and it's, what is philosophy and why is it important?
Yeah. Well, naturally, many people will say different things about what philosophy is and about why it's important, but let me offer my own account. Philosophy is at the very heart of the tradition of wisdom. So philosophy is concerned ultimately with what it means, in all senses of means, to live a wise life. Typically, that involves asking the most essential questions, and typically involves answering those most essential or fundamental questions. But in our culture, when we think about asking and answering, we might think that that remains at a merely conceptual level. And if so, that would be a mistake, because that's only one part of it. So to really be engaged in philosophizing is to discover that the answers that you're coming to are the answers that you necessarily live by. So we might say that you walk the talk. Increasingly, to care about wisdom is to walk the talk when it comes to leading the wise life. Why is it important? The answer is already contained in what I've said so far. If someone objects and says, "Well, I don't care about wisdom," well, that's fine, but then you don't really care ultimately about how you live your life. And I don't. If we assume for the moment that there is a self, a little self, then it's hard not to imagine the little self cares about the shape and substance of his or her life. I think that's a really difficult objection for someone to seriously make in earnest. So if you do care about that question, namely, how shall I live my life, then necessarily you care about wisdom. And wisdom becomes your ultimate answer to that question.
I guess there's different ways of thinking about philosophy. And one way is philosophy is kind of this process of wisdom. Mm-hmm. Also, philosophy is like a deep and rich subject. And there's all these philosophical thinkers that have, that's to me, the beauty about philosophy is you have people that were very similar to you and I that have dealt with the same fundamental issues, the same fundamental problems in life, and they've thought about it. And we have all these traditions and all this thought that somebody else has spent their whole lives thinking about. So we can now take this, and we don't have to necessarily, we're not starting from square one. That's what I'm saying. That's true. And that's kind of the beauty for me in philosophy. But I think one of the things, this is one of the things that I've come across as kind of a barrier or a confusion is, how does one approach such a huge field? Like, how do you choose who to read and where to start? Because there's just so many philosophers and there's so many different lines of thought.
Yeah. Well, you drew a nice distinction between a field, which consists of thinkers, positions, views, theories, and so forth, and a kind of, shall we say, existential energy. So we'll start with the latter, because I want to make sure that we have the right motivating force. That is, it really wouldn't be that helpful to come to what I would call philosophia, the love of wisdom, or loving pursuit of the wise life, if there actually isn't that existential aliveness. Something in you is yearning to answer something very fundamental. If that's not there, it's okay, but you might not want to. You should read something else. And that's something I would say in Zen. Like, if you're not yet into this, it's okay. Do something else. And that's not cheeky. It's not mean-spirited. It's just you enter the door when you're ready, right? When the fruit is ripe, as it were. So once you start to feel, however vague and fuzzy and meandering this longing may be, then you may wish to engage with some of these thinkers. I say may because it's also important to begin to understand that philosophizing, doing philosophy, as it were, doesn't fundamentally require engaging with Locke, Hume, Plato, Socrates, and so forth. It's not necessary, but it is extraordinarily helpful. I'll get to that in a moment. So the second thing you'd want to do is begin to take these questions very seriously. And you want to learn, I think, what I would call the art of philosophical inquiry, which is an art, not a method. But you begin to learn how to ask questions and how to supply answers, be it on your own in a dialogical manner, that is an internal dialogue, so to say, or with others. Right? Either way, you're beginning to learn this art about how the questions get clarified, and as a consequence, they come to, let's say, the heart of the matter or the truth of the matter. And we can discuss that. So let's suppose that you've come alive to philosophy. Let's suppose that you have at least some inkling of how to ask questions and supply answers. Then you may need some friends, some mentors. And I think that's the way I would understand the Western philosophical tradition. If you don't do that, then you think these are impenetrable, threatening, abstruse thinkers. Like you come to a Hegelian text, you think, I have no idea what this means. I have no idea how to begin. So then I would say, once you have a question or two, you can begin to turn to some of these friends and find your entry point. If your question is something to do with what is how does one know anything, then you would be more apt to turn to Immanuel Kant than you would to an ethicist. If your question is, how shall I lead a good life, then you may be more apt to begin with to turn to Plato or Aristotle or the Stoics, because these questions were paramount for them. Not only these questions, but they're questions that are obviously taken up there. So that's the next part. You're learning that your questions are alive, you're taking them seriously, and you're going, just as you would go to a spiritual teacher, in order to help you clarify and understand, to make sense of, to make headway with these fundamental concerns. And then I would suggest, and it would take a while to get into it, but at time you develop a kind of facility with the language, just as you develop a facility with the language of playing music. So there is what educational theorists like E.D. Hirsch would call background knowledge. You develop a sufficiently robust conceptual repertoire to know what qualia means, to know what primary and secondary qualities refer to know what Cartesian substance dualism signifies, and so forth. I'm not going to go through all those terms, but you begin to have a sufficiently robust conceptual set so that you can begin to see that this is exactly what this person is talking about. And lastly, for now, you get accustomed to the fact that philosophy in the Western tradition is a conversation. It's not as though Hobbes just invented Leviathan out of the blue. He was living in a certain cultural moment, a revolution. Society was in shambles. He begins to concoct what a strong state would look like. So he's in conversation with his time. He's also in conversation with the thinkers. So he becomes an early social contract theorist, and you can learn what that means. So you get a horizontal conversation whereby philosopher X is engaged with Y and Z and so on. And you start to know what they're talking about. And you also, I would argue, this is my own sense of the history of philosophy, you need to have something understanding of the historical and cultural moment to see what is the problem that's really getting their goat. Why was Hobbes writing about the strong state as opposed to the philosophy of music? So at some point you begin to find your way in and through your engagement with these various friends. And you get to, shall we say, to put it aesthetically, a kind of taste. There are certain philosophers, friends, who become go-to for you, right? And that's why you start to get a sense of, Nietzsche is a wonderful thinker, and I can't stomach his politics, something like that. Or you find that you might even say, I tend to have Aristotelian leanings, not because it's showy, I hope, or egotistical to say that, but because you're starting to get very clear about what your own coordinates are. You understand where you are on the map, as it were.
Yeah. So, who are some of the friends, mentors, philosophers who have the greatest impact on your life and on your thinking?
Yeah. Well, there are quite a few, but I've already mentioned Socrates. I happen to think that for me, Socrates is a Taoist, and that is strange to say. In other words, what's strange about Socrates, as we all know, is that he didn't write anything during his lifetime, and this is a point in time when literacy was not universal as it is in 21st century America. And there were obviously some doubts that Plato had about literacy. In any case, Socrates did not write. So we only have his thoughts through Plato. And often scholars will say that Plato, in the early Socratic dialogues, there's a set there, is giving us perhaps a fairly accurate representation about what Socratic philosophizing was like. So I'm referring to those particular texts or that particular spirit of Socrates. I should say that everyone has his or her version of Socrates. Some say he's the first. Nietzsche thought he was one of the first rationalists, and he was the one who sought to put Western culture on completely the wrong foot. So Socrates becomes the figure he critiques. There are others who have other critiques of Socrates, and others have defenders of him. But what I find in Socrates through my own practice of philosophizing is something like the following. The dialogues begin with someone walking up to Socrates or Socrates walking into a situation. And I would say there's an improvisational starting point. It is like that. There is a beauty to that serendipitous encounter. You and I right now don't know each other. Here we are. It's a very strange thing. I've never met you in person. You've never met me in person. We had one philosophical conversation together. And yet, here we are. I think that there's something really quite astonishingly raw and true about the fact that you and I are conversing right now. And I think that's what Plato was trying to show us with Socrates bumping into someone and starting the conversation. Secondly, Socrates is really good in those conversations about getting to the heart of the matter. He didn't really beat around the bush. Yes, you might begin with talking about how you're going to raise your children in such a way that they have the proper use of these armaments if they're going to be that. But he's like, he gets the matter and says, well, the question here is, what is courage? That's what you really care about. Or another guy named Euthyphro was about to charge his father with a crime, and it was a very outlandish thing that he was up to. And Socrates says, oh, well, this is all based on the grounds of piety, so we better understand what piety is. So he, secondly, comes to the heart of the matter. And thirdly, my Socrates is someone who is really, really nimble and flexible. This is quite the even Taoist spirit. I don't ever see him shoehorning, this is my own view, or pushing an agenda. He's very delicate. He's drawing the person out. He's allowing the conversation to go wherever it needs to go. And lastly, Socrates is very Zen in this way, leading his conversation partner to a point at which what he really thought he knew, what he thought he had grasped, what he thought was the center of his moral universe has foundered, has failed, has come to naught. So he knows now what he doesn't know. There's a kind of dizzying effect that his conversation partners mentioned at that point. The term is aporia. So I could say more about Socrates, but this is really the first fundamental influence. He's someone who every single time comes to a conversation with openness, freshness, improvisational energy. He doesn't know where it's going to head. And he's equanimous, it seems to me, throughout the process. He's not so easily kerfuffled. He's not jamming things. He's not rigid. It's just a very, very glorious view. There are many others. I'll just mention one other philosopher so as not to make this too long of an answer. The philosopher is Pierre Hadot, Hadot. He was a French philosopher living in the 20th century. He's probably one who brought me back to Socrates so that I can understand what Socrates was really up to. And Hadot argued, I think, quite compellingly. And since 2010 or 9, when he died, he's since taken on some popularity in some of these podcasting and meta-modern circles. But at the time, he wasn't terribly popular. In any case, he argued that the essence of philosophy is that it's a way of life. And that way of life, which is oriented toward wisdom, is based on ascesis or spiritual practices. One would be learning to dialogue, for instance. But there are others as well. And so I thought what he provided me with was an account that was very similar to the three jewels or three refuges in Buddhism. Oh wow, it's not just the case you have Socrates or Aristotle or Plato or Plotinus. In fact, even though I placed Socrates in a kind of milieu, the key from Hadot's point of view is to see that he's involved in a kind of community of practice. There are schools that begin to develop, and they have an orientation toward the good life or the wise life. And they have various practices they've set up and been engaged in with a view to living that kind of life. This was, to me, a very, very beautiful example of what later on led to quite a keen interest in Eastern non-dual spiritual teaching. Because you see these amazing affinities between these various models, between the philosophical life that's grounded in a close-knit school of practitioners who are devoted to this craft, and Adi Shankara, who had his own disciples, own people around him, all engaged in moksha, the path of liberation, final liberation or final release.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Socrates and then you mentioned Hadot and like this idea of grounding your philosophy in spiritual practices. And I've been engaging recently with John Vervaeke's new series. It's called After Socrates, and a big part of what John is trying to do. He's trying to make the path of philosophy, the way of Socrates, like come alive, and it's very much grounded in these kind of ecology of he calls it ecology of practice. These practices you do with community, and very much getting into this dialogue, this dialogos. Mm-hmm. And he also brings a background in Buddhism and Taoism and kind of infuses it. So I'm not sure if you've had a chance to engage with a series, but it feels like it's very much relevant and resonant to what you're saying.
Oh, that's beautiful. I haven't engaged in it, but I do know his work, and I know that he's been quite a prominent voice in his series on the meaning crisis. And I also know that he's been engaged in this Dialogos project, which is really quite seminal. So,
yeah. So maybe you can speak a little bit on the philosophizing together process. How does that work? What does that process look like? Why would somebody want to engage in that rather than just reading a text? And, I'm guessing part of that is, you mentioned already, is the conversation element and how important conversation is to philosophy. But maybe, I have my experience of it just having one session, but I'm just curious how you would explain, how you would talk about this process to somebody who's never experienced it.
If I may turn it back to you, what was your experience?
Yeah, it's interesting. There is this element in therapy where it's almost like an attentional support. Like that's one aspect of therapy. Mm-hmm. And that I found that in our session, there was also this kind of attentional support. It's almost like a scaffolding of one's thoughts. So what I see in this process that's very helpful is the fact that you're not by yourself. Because often when we are by ourselves, whether it's in dealing with different, distressful issues and things like that we may seek therapy for, or whether it's just inquiring into deep philosophical concerns and it's not clear how these things are even separate. It seems like they're often intertwined, but it's almost like we need to brush against somebody else's mind, somebody else's thought. There's something in that process that sharpens our thinking and allows us to kind of see the flaws or limitations in, or just how certain lines of thoughts aren't helpful or whatever. So that's kind of the main thing that I saw. And there is something about it that's different than my experience of like therapy. Not sure exactly how to word it, but I think the fact that there's a certain depth that you have that I experienced is just like really inquiring into what's true and what's really deep and what's really meaningful. It's just something about that just kind of drops you into a deeper state, into just going beyond the certain limitations that you would have, maybe thinking about these questions yourself.
Yeah. That was a very nice answer. Well, I don't really have any potted standard answer to your question, but what it is that it's quite astonishingly interesting about a philosophical conversation. And what I would say is that most of what is of essential value in a philosophical conversation is silence or presence. It's the perfume or the scent that can be smelled and, to mix metaphors, felt in the conversation. There is an atmosphere, a weight, a depth that can't be so readily put into words, but I do think is evident to each of those engaged in it. Something more than you and me, right? Something that binds us together in some ineffable way. So that's sort of the preface, which may not help terribly much, but just has at least a poetic flair to it. I would say also then that what happens with a great question, by great question, I mean an earnest, clear question that's coming out of not knowing. A real question is that the answer is solicited or brought forth. The question is not necessarily one that the answer has been asking himself or herself. That's also crucial, right? That's what's partly being offered. A fresh, a novel, a different question, one that's in a different tone of voice, with a different cadence. And that's what I mean by the soliciting. One is brought forth. And by being brought forth, one is in a position to be able to answer it truthfully, to not con oneself or to beat around the bush or to posture or to defend ground. Right? That there's an openness not only of the mind, but also the heart in that moment. So that alone to me is extraordinary. That is, it's already putting you in that space, so to speak, where there is honesty. But then when the answer comes, it might either be by rote. It might either be something that has long been believed to be the case. It might be habit or a cliche, as it were. But once it's brought forward, right, it's sort of placed between us, in front of us, then it can be examined. And so the questioner isn't just giving it a free pass. If it doesn't have the gravitas of truth, if something about it seems a little bit off, then there can be an, oh, really? Or are you sure about that? Or have you always thought that to be the case? It will depend on the context, but there's a sniff test, right? And not because the questioner is acting egoically or out of personality, but because the questioner has learned a sense that that is not the truth of the matter. So there is that, I think, it's not, this is not like sparring, I should say, though there can be moments of sparring. It is not combat. It is a keen commitment to getting to the very heart of things and an unwillingness to stop halfway. So the questioner then is put in a very raw position, because the answer didn't quite stack up, whatever the answer may be. And the questioner won't let him or her off the hook. So there can be a tearing in that space of, this is not quite it, this is not quite it, that is off, etc., for quite some time. So what is the questioner and the answer? The question and the answer are both learning intimacy, trust, but also courage, right? So that we can remain with something that is not quite fully baked until we are certain that it is. When it is, there's a mutual understanding. So I like to say we see each other and we see this at one and the same time. We see the truth of the matter and we see each other. So it's a we space, but it's also an it, so to speak. And there's something quite magical about this and this at one and the same time. The magic comes through laughter, though it's, how is it felt? It's felt as a kind of relaxation, a kind of laughter and ease, an unburdening, a naturalness. And so that's just one, I obviously slowed things down there in my answer to your question, but that's just one kind of pregnant episode. And then if you start to multiply those over along in a period of time, this conversation, this moment, and that conversation, so on, you begin to get a sketch of the pregnant presence, the sense of non-egoically being here, the relaxation of spirit, the being in the way of truth, as it were. These are different ways of putting what it is like to become what you are, what it is like to be not just open in a conversation, since in some sense that's a fairly trivial matter, but to be open in life, right? To be wide open, to be lighthearted, right? Free-spirited, to meet life in a way that is elastic, dynamic, considerate, gentle, and so on.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. And another thing that comes up for me is I'm curious how the philosophical inquiry process is different than, say, like a self-inquiry practice as proposed by like Ramana Maharshi. Is it simply that the self-inquiry process is you're turning the inquiry on the self, and a philosophical inquiry is more you could be exploring different ideas? How do those things, how do you distinguish them, if you do even?
I would put it, one way of putting the idea would be to say that, yes, philosophical inquiry begins with, as I said about 10 years ago, with whatever it is that you're alive to, or with whatever it is that you're weighed down by. Those are fairly loose indicators. But there's a coming alive to something. We know what that's like. And there's also a burden character of existence. So these are just meant to indicate or to be signposts that point to what I would call the existential. So this is why that there are some people who are having discussions of philosophical ideas, and I would not call that, in my language, a philosophical conversation. It's more of a salon, if you will, which has its place. Big ideas, TED or Big Think or some such. There's a place for this. Or any number of times when you get together with friends and you're kind of just jamming about whether there's a simulation or not. It's fun. But I'm trying to suggest that that's not really coming from the heart, if you will. Nothing is really fundamentally at stake here for you. So that's where it begins. That's the sort of whoosh of it. And then it's a fairly iterative process whereby you come to be alive to what it is you're alive. You develop a kind of attentiveness or felt sense to this. And then there comes to be clarity about the shape and substance of your life. So I would say this since I've been involved in philosophizing for about 11 years now, I would say this is, in my view, kind of the first stage, if you will. It's the first stage of knowing what it's like to lead and examine life. If you go through this long enough, if you have the courage and the interest, then what it should lead you to is the fundamental question. And the fundamental question is, who am I? Every single question, and we can discuss this if this is not clear, is downstream of that question. Even the question of how do I lead a good life is downstream, because it presupposes that there is one who can lead a good life. It presupposes that there is one who is a separate self with a life to lead on his own, with the capacity of free will, and with cognitive processes that allow for deliberation and so on and so forth. That's fine. Those assumptions were basically part of philosophizing. But you get to a point, which is at sort of the edge of philosophy, when you start to ask the question, who's been involved in philosophical inquiry all along? Who is this one? And that's where you get the direct path of Sri Ramana Maharshi. And you might begin to discover that fundamentally so, that your basic assumptions about who or what you are really incorrect. Really incorrect. And then Sri Ramana leads you to realize, he doesn't, but the self-inquiry or Atma Vichara does, that you are the biggest self, as we put in those texts, or the ultimate, the unnameable. So that's the way I've tended to put it. That is you tend to philosophize and philosophize. I think that Socrates basically leads to mysticism, to put it that way, right? If you philosophize and philosophize and philosophize, you realize what you don't know, what you don't know, what you don't know. There's a great sense of openness, to wonderment, astonishment, and so forth. All of your dialogues, inner and outer, leads you to something very, very simple. Very, very simple. Who am I? Who is this one here? Who's been undertaking all these questions in the first place? For whom has there been a question? To whom do these questions keep arising? And you can't get past that point because it's the ultimate starting point. Everything else so if I take myself to be a subject, then I take you to be a you. It's only because I've taken myself to be an I that I can see you as you. It's only because I've taken myself to be an I that there can be a world appearing to me. So you and the world can only appear based on the arising of the I. Who is this I? Who is it? And the proper answer to that initially is, I have no idea. Then it can begin. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the only path of liberation, but I am suggesting, and I think that Sri Ramana is right, that at some point one comes to what or who or where or when am I? It's some variant of that koan.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is essentially all philosophical inquiry, at some point, it boils down to the question of who am I?
That's what I'm saying.
The fundamental question. Mm-hmm. And I think in my experience, I also feel that that's the fundamental question. And you could ask all these other questions, but somehow it always comes down to that. Mm-hmm. And then maybe this is kind of related to it. And this is, kind of bridging meditation and philosophy and seeing how they interact with one another. Like, what is the relationship between them? And, maybe you have somebody who's into philosophy, but they're not into meditation. And you have somebody who's into meditation, they're not into philosophy. And what's interesting is you're deeply engaged in both of these practices. So I'm just wondering how they come together and what the relationship, how do these disciplines interact with each other from your perspective?
Well, the good news is that I think increasingly more people are interested in philosophical thinking and in meditation. Obviously, meditation or some of these spiritual practices in particular have been brought from the East starting in the 1950s and following. So we've had them coming on our shore, that is on the American shores, for some time. And the secularization of these practices, which I think is good and bad, nonetheless, has brought them here. And then obviously certain tech platforms have simplified, modified, and at least dispensed some version of it. So it's just not that uncommon in 2023 to have someone say, I sit for 10 minutes a day and I'm interested in philosophical thinking. That wasn't really the case around 2011, I can tell you. It just wasn't the sort of thing that people were saying. So that's just a kind of fairly interesting historical and culturally infused answer. That is, it's not necessarily as vexing as it used to be. It's not quite as paradoxical as it might seem. Nonetheless, there are certain spiritual temperaments that come. So I would put it this way. A fair number of people will come because of philosophy. And it would go something like this. I'm paraphrasing to an extreme. Here's two versions. Version one, someone felt as if there were some mysterious or interesting matters that he or she couldn't wrap his or her head around when that one was a child. And I'll just say she. And then she goes to a high school counselor and asks some questions, and or maybe to a local priest or some such, and receives answers. And quite astonishingly, perhaps that child doesn't quite buy them, or sort of does, but sort of doesn't. There's we might call this the nagging sense. There's something that's nagging, and then that one goes on to college and maybe takes some college philosophy courses and finds that hopefully I'm not being disrespectful here, but the number of the college philosophy courses might be just about epistemology, study of the nature of knowledge, or maybe it's about metaphysics, but it's understood in terms of what objects are, or whether there is personal identity. The people will report that somehow the courses are intellectually rich, but they're not getting to what I was calling that existential openness before. So maybe then the questions aren't quite answered. Maybe the person starts to struggle in her 20s and she goes to a therapist, and maybe there are some things that are cleaned up. I think that's probably the case. Maybe she learns some forms of introspective clarity or introspective practices. But still, we might say something's nagging. So I like to say that if we keep going on with the story, maybe the person goes on to some coaching, things like that, maybe certain kinds of facilitation. Maybe the one goes into some of these meta-modern circles where there are different kind of practices or modalities. Or maybe the person then goes on ayahuasca. You're starting to get a sense that something remains nagging and unanswered. And I like to say that philosophy is just about the last stop on the train. So that's the first. You get kind of an itinerary in life with something unsatisfying, something missing, and there that provides a certain wending but dynamic process whereby you end up coming to philosophy. That's what I've seen. So that's the first version of someone coming to philosophy. That person may not have any kind of meditation practice. I would argue that if you go on long enough with philosophy, you start to realize that there must be something about that silence, the real taste of the silence, that matters. So there's going to come a time when meditation would be relevant to you in some fashion. In other words, walking, sitting, standing, and meditation is not simply what occurs in a cross-legged position. surely a number of traditions have many ways of understanding meditation. Meditation could be understood as what we essentially are, right? The very nature of consciousness itself. So that's one story about how people come to philosophy. I'll just give you one more. The other version goes like this. Someone is, let's say, successful financially, and also perhaps in terms of his or her career. So we'll pick a guy in this case. So he, for instance, finds that he's in his late 30s or early 40s. Perhaps there is an IPO. This is actually just based on true story. There's right, so the company goes public. This one ends up making some money off of the situation, of the new arrangement. And what he discovers is that there's something deeply missing. In fact, one said, I feel empty. So somehow everything that was an offer in modern culture, status, some wealth, some success, perhaps a nice family, a nice area to live, and so on, right? All that we tend to think about when we're considering a certain conception of happiness, or the goods life, as I call it, right? The goods life, not the good life, but the goods life. So much, right? So this has all gone pretty well, and yet there's one thing. What is that? This person has no idea what that is. In fact, it's completely spellbinding, because precisely what was on offer in modern culture turns out to be insufficient. How can that be? Particularly if one is a first or second generation immigrant coming to the United States with the view of social climbing and with the view to realizing social aspirations and economic aspirations at that. So that's another version of the one who comes to philosophy. So then you have kind of two ways of speaking with people, or rather a way of speaking with people where philosophy is what is the way we begin. So that's one version. I'll just say one other thing. So when it comes to meditation, this tends to attract a different kind of person if the person wants to meditate right out of the gates. And I would say the story is different. It's not told in terms of ordinary life. Something was unsatisfactory, be it in the long term, as was the case in the first story, or be it in a kind of convulsion experience, the second case. Rather, this person would say something like this. I took some psychedelics, or I went on ayahuasca. This is a very common story. You might know this one. I was kind of open, and I took psychedelics, or was on ayahuasca, or something happened the other day, and perhaps there was ego dissolution. Of course, the person doesn't usually say that unless the person's read a little bit about it. But it really caught this one by surprise. Or perhaps there was an out-of-body experience, or perhaps there was a near-death experience. Something like that is the case, right? And then the person's open to actually investigating, but there's really no practice at this point, right? It just seemed to be a we might call it divine blessing, right? Really quite a gift, but there's really no way to make sense of it, no way to realize the truth of it, to be established, to be fully established in the truth. I mean, tons of people have mystical experiences. In a way, so what? If you have mystical experience, ego rises again. And life was pretty much as it was before. Now you just have a memory of a very nice experience. Only spiritual practices or sadhana. This is not quite true, but spiritual practices or sadhana can be quite conducive to the establishment in the truth. So hopefully I'm answering your question. So there are some who come from ordinary life being unsatisfactory, others who tend to come from having experiences that reveal, let's say, loosely higher states of consciousness. These are the entry points, but at some point there tends to be the need, I think, for kind of both, because you need a certain degree of intellectual sophistication. You need to know something about metaphysics, the nature of reality, in order to be able to understand what the Eastern path is like. You need to know something about what ahankara, or the nature of ego, is, something about what the personality is. You need to have some conceptual understanding in order to facilitate going on the path, or at least it's quite helpful. And as for those who are philosophizing, as I said, at some point, they might just find that this is fine. This is not uncommon. They might say, well, life is clearer now. My questions have been answered. But for a fraction of those people, there will be a turn, as you might say, a pivot from philosophizing about ordinary life to non-dual, perennial spirituality. Now that I know that life is set in order, oh, that's all Maya. Okay, interesting. So we were philosophizing about Maya. We were philosophizing about the apparent world. What is all this?
Yeah, so I'm curious if one really goes deep with the who am I question, do these other questions still exist? Is there anything that even wants to ask these other questions?
They're, bluntly put, they're unnecessary. But we usually don't begin there. It's pretty rare to begin there for most of us. But yes, but why would you be asking the question, who am I? Why? Why would that be so? Something must be understood. You must understand, if I may quote Shankara, you must have at least an inkling of understanding that the world is unreal or an illusion in a certain sense. Otherwise, you're going to continue to extrovert and say, "Oh, I'm very interested in social media. I'm very interested in I'm very interested in making a name for myself. I'm very interested in being an influencer, so on and so forth. I can't seem to be unriveted from the local news or the international news." This is what Ramarshi calls extroverting. The mind keeps going to objects. So there must be some inkling in you that the world is unreal, that it is like a dream, as the teaching sometimes says. No more real, no less real than the dream or the 5 to 7 dreams had last night. There must be some inkling about that. There must be at least some inkling that only Brahman is real. There must be some inkling about that in order to ask the question, who am I? And there must be at some point the understanding, and this is not an inkling anymore, that Brahman is also the world. So that's the first part. It's called discrimination. Brahman is not the world. What Brahman truly is, or the ultimate truly is itself, is the only reality. And then there's a realization that the world is also reality. What I'm trying to get at is that that is not usually a place where most people begin. This is usually why there's some account of rebirth, right? That it took thousands upon thousands of births, great karma yoga, and things of that sort. That you can either agree or disagree with that explanatory account. It doesn't really matter, but it's an attempt to try to describe why there are what are called ripe aspirants, really ripe ones, and unripe ones in this lifetime. Why are there some who, in the face of one instance of suffering, think, who am I? And you can find this among certain Chan and Zen practitioners, that there's a natural koan that arises. What is the source of all this? How do you account for that? It's a mystery. Some go right to some version without any help whatsoever, really, of spontaneous self-inquiry. That's what happened to Sri Ramana. That's what happened with others too. But most of us don't. So that's why we end up having usually some metaphor that life is a journey, if I may use that provisionally, right? And then on this, so I'm someone who's on a journey, I'm on an adventure, etc. Throughout the course of this life, I first meet with various kinds of guides and teachers as a kind of building as Raman in the novelistic tradition. All that is just a preamble. It's just a complete long preamble to getting to the trailhead. And the real trailhead is, who am I? What am I? What is all this? You might say, in short, that there has to be a fair amount of brush clearing in order for that question not only to arise, but to be taken really with the utmost earnestness. Otherwise, it just seems like a Monty Python skit. Oh, who am I? Nobody thinks it's a relevant question until you are struck by it.
Yeah, it's almost like why that's not a serious question, I think, is that it's almost like it's like so self-evident. It's so obvious who I am. It's so obvious that I'm over here and I'm this separate being. And it's just like such an obvious thing. So it's not something we necessarily look at. Something that you were saying too, the whole coming to this path through psychedelics. I think that a lot of people came to this path through that way. And I certainly have. And the insight that there's several insights, but I think the big insight for me through using psychedelics was reality is not what it seems. Like, that's what it was. It was just like, no. Like, whatever you thought is real, however you conceptualize it, however you understood that, no, you got that wrong. And for me, that was kind of like the crack in my understanding. That was just like, whoa. So maybe I don't know what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Quite. I want to return to the so-called obvious or self-evident answer. So if we ask the question, who am I? The mind has some answers. I have a name. I was born. I'm going to die. I'm a body or a mind or body-mind composite. I'm a certain personality or a character. All those answers fail. They fail to stand up to what Sri Atmananda Menon would call higher reason, which is a very beautiful way of actually doing the non-dual teaching in a highly philosophical, but let's say more than philosophical way too. Each of them fails. You have a name, the name is contingent. Did you have a name while dreaming? Did you have a name in deep sleep? No. But you undeniably are. Therefore, you are in the presence or the absence of this name. Well, consider the possibility that you are the body. The body is changing moment by moment. Are you changing moment by moment? Is what you are, that is to say, changing moment by moment? That comes up with some pretty preposterous results. That there's self one at time t1, self two at time t2, self three at time t3, and so forth. Nobody actually believes in one's bones, so to speak, that that's true. I could keep going on, but all I'm doing is casting doubts on these commonsensical answers. And so it just prepares the way for taking that question, as I said before, with the utmost seriousness. So that's a bit of a neti. Oh, I'm not this. At least intellectually, I begin to understand that I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm not the senses, I'm not name or shape. Okay. If you run through those, there are various kinds of beautiful analytic arguments, analytic meditations, often enough, be it through middle way Buddhism, be it through Atmanandian direct path reasoning, the freshness, right? It's very Socratic. Again, if I may use that theme, you start to realize very fully, I know that I don't know. Then there is supreme openness to the very mystery of this most undeniably ultimate question. And so what the teachings really say at this point is abiding in that openness. It's the openness to divine grace. Nisargadatta will say, abide as I am. That's it. Abide as I am. Abide. What does that mean? It means the complete resting of mind. The complete thought-free state. Thoughts may rise, they may not rise, but I abide as I am, wordlessly, humbly, almost hungrily, but also very patiently. I just give Nisargadatta because he has a very beautiful way of talking about this. Nisargadatta being a pretty famous 20th century teacher of Advaita Vedanta. But there are other ways of so to speak, putting one in that place, placeless place, that's right at the edge, right at the cusp, right on the borderland of realization. Or we might say right on the borderland of the full dissolution of residual ignorance. Be a bit more accurate way of putting it.
Yeah, so something else that came up on our call together is you mentioned the notion of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and showing up, which of course can be attributed to Ken Wilber. You also mentioned that you are not a Wilberian. So I'm curious which of Wilber's ideas you agree with, which you disagree with. What do you think that, what is out of his teachings doesn't resonate that you see kind of differently?
Okay, well, let me try to be charitable here, because I don't want to enter into mean-spiritedness. Well, firstly, I think that what's great about Ken Wilber is that he's a systematic philosopher. You may say along the lines of Hegel. We don't have a lot of systematic philosophers. By that, I mean that, as one American philosopher put it, whose name I can't recall all of a sudden, philosophy is about seeing how things hang together in the broadest possible sense of how things hang together. Something like that. He is trying to give an account of everything. I think that is a Herculean task for sure. Right? Try to bring together everything and put it into a single systemic, coherent approach. It has its downsides that the Frankfurt School critical theorists would point out but then they would kind of deconstruct some of these downsides. But I think that there's something quite admirable in that. I think it's also admirable that he takes insights from, let's say, Jungian depth psychology. He takes insights from, I think he knows more about Buddhism, and he's also bringing them together. So you don't just have depth psychologists who are interested in the integration, right, holism of the personality, because after all, there's still a question: what's the personality? Sure, there's no longer the wound, but what is this thing, right? He puts that question, though, together or alongside the question of waking up. So he takes seriously, I would say, thirdly, if I may also give him some praise here, he's one such who's been keen to explore the problem of spiritual bypass. Okay, so that term has come up on this podcast, meaning that those engaged in waking up can bypass cleaning up, meaning they can inadvertently go around psychological baggage. That would take a while to unpack, but obviously he cares about both. And I think that's very laudatory. I'm sure I could say more, but one of the areas so here's where I would find myself disagreeing. One thing I disagree with is this quadrants, this I, it, we, it's. That'd be one such. I wouldn't want to put things in the grid that way. For instance, I think the process of waking up is inextricably interwoven with cleaning up and with we space. It's not as though I kind of shift quadrants and I say, now we're in a we space modality, so we're going to be engaged in circling or some such. And this is somehow ontologically different from waking up. Or let me maybe be clear. I think most of the Eastern traditions that I'm aware of have what they usually call purification. Depends if it's not a direct path inquiry, meaning that there could, for example, be ethical practices like the six paramitas in Mahayana Buddhism. That is, you start with giving and you go through a series of virtues. It's a virtue ethics practice. And this is really part of cleaning up, right? It's attenuating being an ego self through these practices. Now, it's not fully waking up because there's still a doer in some way engaged in ethical practice for most, but it's a marvelous part of purification. or purgation, as Christian mystics would say. And so hopefully you're starting to see that I don't necessarily see cleaning up over here and waking up over there. To take those two I'm most familiar with from this model. I think that they're inextricably interwoven. I would give pride of place, however, to waking up. So cleaning up, I would argue, is fundamentally in the service of waking up. If you begin to see through your psychological baggage, you're beginning to see through particular ego selves on behalf of which there is suffering. As you begin to see through ego self, naturally the question arises, who is the one seeing through the illusion of ego self? That self-inquiry, which is engaged in the process of waking up. So I tend to think, in other words, that the psychological inquiries are hooked up, cleaning up, are hooked up to the deeper inquiry about what there ultimately is. So I wouldn't want to compartmentalize in quite the way that he does there in his 2x2 quadrant.
Yeah, I'm wondering if he does that as a way to kind of show how people think from different perspectives, and that's why they kind of, because I kind of feel like he would agree with what you're saying, how waking up and cleaning up are kind of intertwined. Although you do have, it does seem that you can have somebody that can have genuine spiritual realization and then still have these shadow sides and these kind of unexplored things that, you know, you might not necessarily address in deep meditation retreats, but you might address in a psychotherapeutic setting.
Sure.
So, yeah, I'm not sure I'm even seeing that much of a disagreement between what you said and what he does. Let
me offer the one disagreement that would be true. So I'm an idealist. Let's accept your I'll concede the first one. Maybe we're in agreement, but I'm not a materialist or a physicalist. So the top right corner, I simply don't buy from a philosophical point of view. So here's where we're getting into the philosophical stakes, meaning I don't think that there is an it. Idealism would say that we can only start with phenomenal experience or subjective experience. So there are others who would not take that. There actually have been physicalist accounts that have been trying to marry a Western physicalist accounts according to which what is physical with the Eastern teaching. I think what the Eastern teaching is saying, if I may quote Huang Po, is that there's only the universal mind, right? Or universal consciousness. And that universal consciousness, depending on the view taken, tends to emanate or manifest. But every emanation or manifestation is still consciousness stuff, or awareness, if that's the preferred term here. So I would agree with Bernardo Kastrup and others like him who are arguing along highly idealist lines. For instance, he would say, if I may cite him, that when it comes to the brain, what is that? Now, have you ever seen your brain? No. Have you touched it? You can't even touch your head. What's this? This is just touching, right? This is the headless way, if you've come across that. Okay. You can't even touch your head, let alone your brain. So how is the brain going to be an account of the arising of personal consciousness, let alone universal consciousness? Well, Kastrup would say that basically you can account for what we call the brain from a second person point of view. If a scientist opens up Andrew's head and on the screen sees a representation of a brain, he will have a mental representation of what he's going to call Andrew's brain. That's a concept. It's a valuable concept. It's not trivial, but he's still in the realm of mentation, of universal mind from this interpretation. I think this is the most, as if I may quote Kastrup again, parsimonious way of doing the non-dual teaching and of accounting for our actual experiences. You never encounter a wall, you encounter seeing. You never encounter a a tree, you encounter also seeing or hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. That's the starting point for the investigation, what's called qualia, or subjective experience. Once you accept that, then you've already rejected the idea that you can start by positing an it, because all you can begin with is experience. And what's great about that is that it allows you to very easily go through the non-dual spiritual practice, because you're going from experiences, perhaps if I may use Advaita Vedanta, to witness state. The witness state will give way to pure awareness. Right? So it's an easier way of teaching not only the philosophy of idealism, but also an easier way of teaching meditation. Meditation as a certain art of conceptual and above all non-conceptual understanding. So I don't think that scientists are actually getting at the it. They're providing us with conceptual models relative to points of view, which is very valuable. I'm not arguing that. I'm not saying you can't get involved in science or the scientific method, but I am suggesting along these lines that if you think you're getting at the thing, the Ding an sich, as Kant said, you're not. Right? That too is involved in experience. You're always already enmeshed in phenomenal experience.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap with. I'm very much familiar with Kastrup's work, and I'm actually always looking for people that can argue against what he says, and just because that's interesting to me is to find somebody that can argue against what he says, because so much of what he says just resonates for me, and I haven't really found anybody that, from my perspective, has been able to argue against his, the idealism position, which is kind of my position too. That's kind of my view too. It does seem that the quadrants, because I think Wilber probably holds the same position deep down inside. And I think that he's using the quadrants as a way to integrate this relative view that a lot of people hold, this, something that's not ultimately true, but there appears to be an it or it's, even though it's not ultimately true. So I'm just wondering, but to me, just this whole exploration of, it's been interesting looking at idealism, and I'm glad that you brought up Kastrup's name, because I've brought him up in several podcasts and very much interested in his thinking. He's actually done a lot of stuff on dissecting other philosophers like Schopenhauer and Carl Jung, and
I've read both of those books.
Yeah. He's saying that Carl Jung's
I think the reason, yes, we won't go too far in this direction today, but I'll simply say that the reason he's attractive, I think, the reason it's hard to find someone disagreeing with him, I think, is because the people who are interested in his work are people like me. And the reason we're interested in his work is that he provides an analytic, philosophical treatment of non-dual metaphysics without saying that explicitly. In other words, he's making palatable, I don't know if you'd put it this way, but this is the way I would interpret him. He's making palatable, I would say, the teaching of Advaita Vedanta in the language of analytic philosophy. So he's using all the conceptual and analytic distinctions, the manners of argumentation we find in analytic philosophy. If your viewers don't know, analytic philosophy is a form of Anglo-American philosophy. It's different from what's called continental. So it's a rapprochement. It's a Trojan horse of sorts. It's a bringing it in a manner that would allow it to appeal to the intellect. And as he says, the intellect is the bouncer of the heart. That's one of his catchphrases. So it doesn't take you all the way home, though. One of the things that I'm sure he would be willing to concede is that what you really need is the spiritual teaching from what I would call high-octane teaching masters. If you read Nisargadatta, it's higher octane, I hope he's not offended, than reading Bernardo Kastrup's work. It has, or if you read Huang Po, Raman Maharshi, they're not providing you with a systematic thinking. They're systematic for sure, but they're not providing you with a systematic layout of the land that he does. But the power, I feel it right now, the sheer power of their teaching is resonant. It's a transmission, right? It's a blessing. So we need both, right? We definitely need. Well, for those of us, not everyone needs this. Some people are very bhakti, and then they can realize the divine love, and that's, I think, it's completely acceptable on the whole for some who are quite ripe. But for those who are intellectually curious, there are certain thinkers, and Kastrup is not the only one, who really lay it out clearly. And I would say it basically resolves your mind concocted doubts. You can call it a kind of satsang. But then you dive very deep into meditation of all sorts, in order to realize the truth. For example, it's not simply enough to know that there could be a theory of alters that accounts for the belief and feeling that I'm a separate self. Okay, that's fine. But how do you really feel that in your bones? Have you really discovered that it's true? Have you really discovered that what is true is only universal consciousness? As Zen Buddhists would say, you cannot find that in any book whatsoever. So you might as well burn them. I'm just kidding about the last part, but right. At some point, even the scriptures, all books, become an impediment if you're holding on to ideas or concepts. That's where Zen, I think, it provides us with an immensely important teaching.
Yeah, it's interesting too, like just kind of interacting with you and your approach being this kind of having this analytical rigor really reminded me of Kastrup's approach. And I also love that quote that he says that the intellect is the bouncer of the heart. And for so many of us, we do have to kind of overcome the doubt. We have to kind of overcome the mind and these barriers to getting into the heart. Not everybody can just, get right into the heart. Mm-hmm. There was a question that I had. Mm-hmm. Now it's like it disappeared into the silence. Yeah, something that I wanted to. You mentioned at the beginning, and I never spoke on it, but I wanted to kind of bring it back up. And you mentioned you're losing your sister at a young age, mm-hmm. and you said that you mentioned at a call. I didn't pick up on that, but that obviously was a big catalyst for you to kind of pursue the path. And mm-hmm. There's people that are probably listening to this that went through some kind of loss or dealing with some kind of suffering, and I'm just wondering if the only way kind of, there's obviously grief, there's obviously that pain that's there, but is it really, I don't know how it's been in your experience, but is kind of working through that, getting through that grief and coming to accepting all of that, like, is a lot of that in seeing that the self, kind of the solid self is, there is no solid or separate self. Is it the sting, the suffering that comes with losing somebody? A lot of it is in the my sister, the my father, the my brother. So I'm just wondering how that process was. It that kind of seeing through the solidity of the identity? Is that what alleviates the suffering that we feel in losing somebody?
The short answer is yes. Robert Bea, who may have come up on this podcast, would call it "Seeing That Freeze."
Yeah, he's one of my favorites. "Seeing That Freeze." Robert mm-hmm. Bea. He also passed away, unfortunately, at a young age. But
yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. He passed away. I think he died of cancer too, which is their modern scourge. Sometimes you come across this. Let me give you a standard answer in satsang. Sometimes you come across the following kind of question. A mother comes to Ramana Maharshi or to Nisargadatta or to someone else, to stick with Ramana Maharshi, and says, I lost my son at the age of 15. But he was at the age of 15. And I have been inconsolable since. That happened a year or so ago. In fact, the same question comes over and over again to Zen Master Bankei and to others. because they've come to Raman Maharshi, he basically tells it straight. He wouldn't be telling it straight if he said, do some kind of puja, do some kind of worship, go back to your rituals, be very Vedic, something like that. He says something very straight, like, were you ever born? Were you born? If you weren't born, then everything that seems to have happened has only been an apparent happening. So you need to find out whether you were ever born. You need to know that. That's the straightest. It's another version of who am I? And it does mean, it's a little bit like this. At some point we could discuss, perhaps at another time, what the ego is. But let me just provide one image rather than a deep philosophical account. First of all, there isn't one ego. There are egos. But let's suppose, for the sake of this reply, that there's just one ego. Ego is a bit like a peg that's put on the wall. And you can put your hat on the wall, you can put your coat on the wall, only so long as there's a peg. So if you think you're going to address the problem by burning your hat, by getting a different hat, by getting a nicer coat, by getting a more durable coat, by placing the coat and the peg in a different manner, and so on and so forth. So I would call these forms of self-help, right? You haven't looked at the fundamental issue, the fundamental assumption, namely that the peg is precisely what it makes possible hanging all your concepts on it in the first place. Without the peg, there's nothing to hang anywhere. So if I may use Zen language, there is no body, there is no thing, there is no path, there is no enlightenment, liberation, there is no non-liberation, there are no others, obviously there is no self. Sometimes that sounds accidentally nihilistic. And it's not, because if it sounds nihilistic, that's only because you're still holding on to a separate self, positing a separate self who's lonely in some kind of void space. Let go of that, and there's just emptiness, which is fullness, fullness, which is emptiness, to run together Buddhism and the Isha Upanishad. So I think what can be somewhat hard to grasp is that I'm going to be unjustifiably teleological. So I don't know if this is actually philosophically substantiated what I'm about to say. It's just an intuition I have. The intuition is that every single instant in this life is meant to wake us up. I don't mean that my sister died so that I could wake up, but I do mean that her death grips, it pulls apart. It's that crack you spoke about after psychedelics, right? And it's not just that event. Every single event, every time I accidentally speak ill to my wife is that, right? Every single one is suggesting or opening me to the possibility that I'm not what I think I am. And if I'm not what I think I am, and if I'm not what I feel I am, then perhaps there is something to this non-localizable, unlimited, that is to say, boundless, eternal presence that truly is. Perhaps I am that. Perhaps I am eternal presence. And if that's true, then even though appearances, we can say, come and go, eternal presence as eternal presence goes nowhere, can neither be gained nor lost. So that's what the apparent loss of a sister or a loved one, from the point of view of the non-dual teaching, is offering. it's offering the possibility that suffering is only because of misunderstanding, what Advaita Vedanta would call ignorance. So it's allowing me to meet the ignorance. And if I look at it very closely, it dissolves. And the one looking at it dissolves. I should add, however, this is pretty brass knuckles, so to speak, right? This is not the way, this is upaya or skillful means is offered by the teacher, the teaching. So if someone, a woman were inconsolable, and Ramana, for instance, could see that, he might say, love your other sons, or be involved in karma yoga, right? Be involved in selfless devotion to others. That would be perfectly acceptable. It might not be the end of your suffering during this lifetime, but it would be a very compassionate reply. So the other thing to say is that even though we're on a podcast, which will be listened to by who knows who, the what doesn't scale in this teaching is precisely the specificity of the linguistic and non-linguistic context between the I and the thou, as Martin Buber would say.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And that's a big thing you find with Ramana's teachings. It's like he had levels. Depending on where you were at, he would meet you at that level.
For sure.
Yeah, so this has been a fascinating conversation, Andrew. I really appreciate your depth of knowledge and your presence and clarity of thinking. I'm just curious if there's anything else that's alive for you, anything else in your mind, anything else you want to say before we wrap up.
I don't think so, except to say that I really appreciate your presence as well. I can tell that you have been quite engaged in the conversation, quite openly listening. I like what Jean Klein, who is a contemporary teacher of Advaita Vedanta, says. It's a lot of beautiful poetic metaphors, and one is simply that the non-dual teaching is listening. One is listening without a listener, he would say. Right? There's just listening without a listener. So in any case, thank you very much for the conversation today.
Yeah, I think it's easy to do that with you. So appreciate you. Thanks so much, Andrew.
You're welcome.
All the best.
Take care.